it has always been because they've introduced a technology that overreached. It always overreaches on the first implementations. The social response has always been mobilized and said no. And then the technology companies say, okay. And then they erase any evidence of any resistance, of any history of that resistance from the social spheres.
All right. Very happy to be joined by Eryk Salvaggio and Caroline Sinders. Both, thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. Really excited.
Yeah, me too. You're both such multidisciplinary thinkers, artists, practitioners that I'd love if you'd be willing to share your background in your own words, like give audiences a sense of who you are and what's animating your practices. Caroline, maybe I'll throw it to you first.
Yeah, sure. I'm a human rights technologist and artist, and a lot of the work I do is really driven by research and thinking of how research can manifest in a variety of different ways. So this is something Eryk and I actually talk about a lot. We in a very, I guess, particular like North American context talk about a lot, which is how art is a legitimate form of research, especially when you look towards Europe and like other countries even outside of Europe, of how the arts are recognized as a research practice. The pursuit of even making something is a form of critical and creative practice. So for me, a lot of my work is sort of driven around how technology impacts people, and through a human rights context, how it disproportionately impacts marginalized groups, and how that then further impacts, let's say, our safety, our right to privacy, and the manifestation of digital rights, which are human rights translated into technology in the digital space. And then for me, art becomes another conduit of either exploring those questions or manifesting different kinds of research that I've done.
Amazing. Thank you. Eryk.
I am, I call myself an artist and researcher, and oftentimes they're assumed that those are two different things, but it is artist and researcher with quotes around it, because I have always, for 25 years, I've been working as an internet artist, I've been working as a visual artist, working with sound and all of these things as a way of engaging with technology and new technology, and also to develop a sort of critical relationship with those technologies. So in the early days of net art where I was working, it was thinking about media and network power and making work as a way of trying to understand how that power moves through these technologies. And so now in the last 4 or 5 years, I've been sort of leaning more into artificial intelligence and the way that it can make things, and how power is sort of infused into those things, and whose power and how's that power being wielded are questions that are at the heart of that practice. So art and research to me are one and the same thing, and they have been for quite some time. And that's kind of at the core of my answer to who I am and what I'm up to.
Amazing. I want to zoom in on this topic that both of you have brought up around arts practice being research rather than it being like the research track of your life and the arts track of your life. Could you reflect a little bit more on what that means sort of broadly in your estimation, but also what that's meant particularly in your practice? And the other thing maybe kind of embedded into that conversation is I think there are misconceptions around the word critical. So if you could frame what you mean when you say that you're approaching your practice from a place of critique.
I have always approached this idea of critical as almost like a synonym for thoughtful, that we are thinking critically, and that means thinking critically, right? That means thinking with a critical lens on. It doesn't necessarily mean criticism. Critique is a way of thinking about, not necessarily thinking badly about. But when you're focusing on questions of power, especially when you're thinking about things like automated power and whose assumptions are being automated into an artificial intelligence system, that critique, that thoughtful analysis oftentimes kind of scrapes up against that tension of criticism, because we live in a very imperfect world and there's a lot wrong with it. There's a lot wrong with the way that power is distributed. There's a lot of problems with the way that we implement these technologies on people who can't sort of resist them or don't know how to resist them. And so criticism becomes part of that. It becomes very tightly connected, but it really just emerges from being thoughtful. And so for me, it goes about looking at multiple layers of the system, looking at some of the assumptions in these systems that people have when they make them, and not assuming necessarily that they are designed well. Increasingly it becomes harder to separate it from the idea that they're designed to sort of like implement these power structures, but sort of separating that and just looking at how they work in order to perpetuate those power structures. That's kind of at the heart of my definition of critical critique and so on.
Totally. And I think to build on that, one of the things that, I think one of the things that is probably very aligned in my work and Eryk's work is, the idea of nuance, and that there is nuance to understanding different systems. There is nuance in terms of how you go about investigating a system. For me, I approach critical and criticality under a few different lenses, but also very similar to Eryk's. It's a thoughtfulness. Again, I think of it also as understanding the nuance and context. So things are rarely, if ever, binary. And so the labels of good and bad are not quite good enough. So there are benefits and then there are harms, obviously, to artificial intelligence, but even like a particular system. And for me, I'm often very interested in what are the harms? How do they disproportionately harm? What are the asymmetries of a system? And how do I surface that? And how do I also understand that? And that, to me, often then reveals a lot about the system, a lot about how the system was made, ways to improve that system, ways in which that system is having all different kinds of unforeseen impacts, including, with like law and policy, to just, again, how it disproportionately can impact very specific groups. And then also how can the way in which that system is designed also have unforeseen, I don't want to say consequences, but like unforeseen outcomes. And I think that gets at the heart of some of the work Eryk and I have done, like as a part of a collective called ARRG, but also sort of individually. Then another definition I have of criticality is also like, I am a critical designer. So critical design, which is very closely related to speculative design, created by Dune and Rabi during their time at the Royal College of Art in London, is how do you think about product design when you remove capitalism, when you remove sort of corporate structures around it? As a designer who's also an artist, that's something I'm very intrigued by. And how do you apply that to software? Dune and Rabi, I think, we're often contextualizing this or thinking about it through a particular lens of industrial design and things that are tangible, that you can touch, that you're kind of engaging with. And I'm very interested in how do you apply that to intangibilities like technology and software. And so what does it look like to try to make things that can be useful but non-capitalistic? And how is that then also an art practice? And I think that is like what also drives a lot of my artificial intelligence inquiry work. If you look at something, let's say like feminist data set, which is a project of mine. So I think for me, there's many different slices and definitions of criticality that we could sort of look at and call upon. But probably the most basic one to sort of go with is understanding the nuance of a system and using investigations as a lens to understanding that nuance to sort of really highlight and map out the asymmetries that can, again, include all different kinds of harms, including human rights harms, including like policy harms, to then just different kinds of unexpected errors that might not harm, in heavy quotes, anyone, but are still not accurate, also in heavy quotes. And thinking about that also as a conduit of exploration, and also just something that is worthwhile to document. Like there might not be a problem if we make a camera that has a hard time with the color blue, but that's still an error, if you will, if the goal was to have blue being shown. And by discovering that, I think that there's something often interesting in doing that, to use this kind of sloppy metaphor.
Mm.
Just to build on that, I think the minute you recognize that there is a system, you realize the complexity of a system, and the minute you start realizing that there is complexity there, you're working with nuance. You have to be, because complexity, you are essentially, when you reduce a complex system to binaries, you lose the system, you lose the view of that system, you lose the relationships and the interactions that exist within that system. So I think as artists, there's a really a way of engaging with systems from a point of curiosity that is actually a really useful tool to figuring out how these things are interacting, what these relationships are, and sort of poking and prodding at them, but in a kind of safe way, in a way that makes, a piece of work, as opposed to something harmful or risky.
Mm. Eryk, I want to follow up with you on that. And Caroline, you as well. When thinking about, like, in your identity toolkit, your artist hat, how are you differentiating what your efforts and outputs are relative to, Eryk, your work as an educator, as a theorist, Caroline also as a theorist, as a designer and researcher? Like, when are you walk me through that sort of can of worms.
Totally. Eryk, do you mind if I start?
Go for it.
So for me, like, very roughly, like, my workflow is like very, very, very broadly. There's like 3 steps to it. There's obviously like much more within that. But the way I kind of go about my work usually is I start with research, because I find it really, really practical. And so research for me is, it can be working with communities to help further document a phenomenon they're experiencing, to help make that phenomenon seen as more legible by power structures. And we could get into a whole side conversation of the issues with that. This is like why we need to have decolonization, especially around research and data. But a lot of the work that I do will just start with research. It'll often start with human rights, or from like a human rights context, or from like a different kind of investigation that I'm doing. And so that is often sort of like built around a question or something, like some kind of urgency or need. The next step is activism and advocacy, because it's helpful. So taking that research, and usually in an academic context, if you're thinking of like a solution, you'd need to test it. In the human rights space, there's like a very firm belief that I stand with, which is that by threat modeling the outcome, so by like discussing with local communities, with different kinds of technology experts, of policymakers, of thinking about what it is we're suggesting, you're effectively testing it, because you're testing out or mapping out what are all the likely threats and unlikely threats that could come out of this thing I'm suggesting, right? This is where like getting stakeholder feedback is incredibly important. So for me, like, the next step has to be advocacy and activism of like, what are we going to do with this research? And that is still feeding into the art practice. Now, the last step for me is what we would probably think of as more traditional art. So for me, it's where I take all those 2 other threads, and I'm then going to make some kind of art project out of them. So it's very rare that I will start an art project on a topic that I have not spent either many hours or even like years already looking at. Because for me, it's actually really important that I understand like the peaks and valleys of a problem, particularly like a piece of technology, if I'm going to explore it in an artistic context. And one of the reasons is I think art is incredibly powerful. I think it's one of the most powerful tools we have as a society. Art can make visible invisibilities. Art can sort of visualize or show future or present urgencies in a new way. It often can, even if it's not intended to teach people about a topic, right? That might be the thing that someone reflects back on about a very particular topic, is like the art project they saw, and maybe not like the article they read. And I think that that's actually the beauty and power of art. But I also think with like great power comes great responsibility. And so I think it's actually really important, if you're looking at different kinds of social justice topics, right, to really understand the different nuances of what it is you're thinking about and talking about or manifesting in the art project, or not manifesting, or you're deciding to like not acknowledge or nod to. And for me, I always want to make sure that it's something like 5 years from now or 10 years from now that I would still stand behind and say, like, you know, this is something I thought about. Like, I thought about how it was going to impact people in this way, or I thought about, you know, the implications and how people could misunderstand or understand the project. And those are the same kinds of questions I have to ask myself anyway when I do human rights and policy research, is like, how will this age over time? How will this impact like a discourse that I'm a part of? So for me, they are incredibly blended. Like, I don't really see them as separate, though it might like look separate to other people because the art project might not be inside of the human rights report, right? Or there might be like a lag of like a year or 2 years or 5 years. But for me, they are so close together because it's pulling from this practice that I have, and there's no real way to sort of separate them in my mind.
Mm.
It always starts with a system of interest, and the first thing that happens is I want to discover what it does. I know working in policy circles and talking to people who are thinking about technology, oftentimes there's a disconnect between actually using that technology and talking about how it is used. And so for me, it's always been really important to have some understanding of what the structure of the thing we're talking about is. And I've seen, particularly around AI, that a lot of assumptions about how systems work influence the way we think about those systems, not always in great ways, especially when it does come to questions about policy or regulation or even norms, right? We use these in ways that are established through the kind of stories that the systems tell on their own. And if we buy into those stories, then we're kind of giving away a great amount of critical thinking. But it can be very easy to give those stories away, or give our sort of perspective away to those stories. So I always want to see, okay, we have this thing, let's say an image generation tool, right? Let's use it. Let's figure out how it works by observation. I'm going to give it some inputs. I'm going to see what I get back from it. I'm going to look at that feedback loop. And I'm going to then start to think about what has it given me? How has that responded? And then I come up with some theories. And the minute I have some theories, the research begins. So the research is not just feedback anymore. It's not just the observation of how the model responds. It's going into the white papers. It's going into the conversations that I've seen from developers. What problems were these tools designed to solve? And then to think about how they were structured, how that logic has been applied, which is how you get to sort of an understanding of a AI diffusion model is actually a noise reduction tool, right? That's actually the logic that is imposed within it. And when you understand that it is not actually a tool for making images, it is actually a tool for removing noise from an image, you have a very different relationship to it that allows you to have a different set of insights than you might otherwise. And so from that set of insights, that artwork then sort of evolves into the manipulation of what this system actually is and what it does. And that's creates a new sort of feedback loop of observation, right? Input, output, observation, input, output, observation, classic cybernetics. And then from those observations, you can start putting together the theories, put together more research, and hopefully write about them. And so in the process of making this sort of visual work or sonic work, which I often do, it's the writing that emerges from it that goes into sort of more traditional frames of research, but it's almost actually a byproduct of this feedback loop that I am caught in with the technology of input, output, observation, response. And so it's all kind of this nicely packaged recurring feedback loop at this point.
But I'd also say what you described earlier, Eryk, is research. Like, that is a research practice, right? Like, you are like heavily engaging in an investigation of a system, and that in and of itself, right, is research. And then that informs, I guess, your more traditional research and heavy quotes like a paper, but also like your artistic practice, which I think is how our practices are really aligned. Like, I don't think you would, if someone was like, okay, Eryk, in 1 month, will you produce something about like blockchain? You'd probably be like, I would need to spend a little bit more time thinking about it, maybe.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
Go
The
ahead.
the cybernetic circle is also the scientific method, you know? Input, output, observation, feedback.
Well, thinking in systems, one from a loose standpoint commonality that I observe in your practices, though in many ways they're very different, is this relationship of order and glitch, like taking an ordered system and glitching it in a very particular way to surface some aspect of, whatever the like status quo understanding of that system is. So like, Eryk, I'm thinking about Because of You, but also a lot of the work that you put into your YouTube, the course that you recorded and put on YouTube, which is amazing, highly recommended.
Thanks.
And then Caroline, even something like Feminist Dataset is in its way a big glitch, even though it reads as very ordered, because of the claims it's making about the context that it exists in. So I want to throw open that conversation about glitch, intervention, and order. Eryk, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. I can start with sort of a simple version, which is leading back to that diffusion conversation about these AI image generators as noise reduction algorithms. And that understanding sort of led me to think about, well, how can I poke at that? How can I play with that as an artist? And so one of the things I started doing was asking it to produce images of noise, because it is a noise reduction algorithm. So if you ask it for an image of noise, you create this sort of glitching feedback loop. And the result is you get images that really are not meant to be produced by this tool. They don't reference the data set, which is really interesting because these things are built on data sets, right? They're constantly referencing styles and structures of other images. But when you use it in this way, you've glitched the system into producing something that it is not intended to produce. And I think that's an important relationship to have with these technologies. I think it's an interesting model for a relationship to have with these technologies, which is to think about what are they not supposed to do and how do I get them to do that? So I've been taking that kind of approach and also thinking about the errors that you can intentionally induce into a system, but also the errors that we actually just kind of wave away. So the piece that you've mentioned, which is called Because of You, it tells this story. It's a bit of a AI-generated documentary, although it's not exactly generated by AI, but AI image generation was used in producing it. And it actually kind of recontextualizes the givens about how these systems work and actually reveals that they are in fact glitches. By telling the story of Henrietta Lacks, who maybe I'll just skim very quickly, died of cancer in 1951, was more or less an anonymous woman, anonymous black woman from the South, whose cells were taken without her knowledge, without her family's knowledge, and they actually contained the remarkable property, which is that they reproduced endlessly. And as a result, they became this really key component of all kinds of medical research. But also as a result of that, the person, Henrietta Lacks, was literally misnamed. Her name was wrong in the files, but got reduced to Hella after a while. Once they finally figured out who the actual person was, she still wasn't sort of identified. And this data about her body became completely separated from this data about who she was and the actual experience of who she was and the body that the cells came from. And what we're thinking about with Dr. Avijit Ghosh, who is my collaborator on this project, what he was in particular thinking about was that connection to the training data used in AI systems and how that removes the sort of experience of our actual lives that are producing this data and being recontextualized as data, that our social media posts, our images and whatever are being sort of put together and analyzed and taken away from us, quite literally. The context of ourselves is stripped. And so we decided, okay, what does an image of Henrietta Lacks look like? What is an image generation tool going to give us? And it is distant from Henrietta Lacks's actual portraits. It will not generate an actual portrait of Henrietta Lacks. There are not many existing portraits of Henrietta Lacks, and so it creates this image that essentially, quote unquote, looks like Henrietta Lacks. But then if you animate it, it actually moves frame by frame to this very sort of 2024 contemporary looking black woman who does not look like Henrietta Lacks. And that's a glitch. And it may not be something that we think about, which is that in the absence of data, the machine makes things up, right? We call this a hallucination. Hallucination is a fancy word for a glitch. It's just a mistake. But there's also things that are not identified even as hallucinations or as glitches. And one of them, I'll put a hashtag spoiler on this, but in the film, it's narrated by Dr. Avijit Ghosh, who I mentioned, and he speaks naturally when you meet him with a Indian Bengali accent. And yet, what we did is we trained a voice synthesis tool on a snippet, about 16 seconds of his voice, and then you could type the script, and it would read that script in his voice. But because his voice was 16 seconds and building on this chorus of North American training data, the voice comes out entirely without any accent, right? His voice is completely stripped of his own life context. And that is also a glitch, but it's not something we talk about as a glitch. We consider this a usable product, right? These voice tools are considered, that's just something that happens in a lot of the ways we talk about these things. It certainly did not stop the tool from getting released, but it is a glitch. And so that's a bit of a long-winded way, but it was like, hopefully you take it as a case study of the ways that glitch can reveal certain kind of logics about what are we fixing, what are we not fixing, what are we leaving be, and that usually reflects the position of the people building these tools, right? That most of these people have a certain set of boundaries where they say this tool is acceptable or this tool is not there yet. And that is very porous and very fluid. But when people make those decisions, they're oftentimes sort of shaped by their own background, their own sense of what's acceptable and what is not. So being an artist, I'm in a good position to sort of explore those and exploit those glitches in ways that could tell that bigger story. And hopefully that's what comes out of it when people watch it.
Mm.
And I'd say also to like build on that, Jesse, you are like also a very like renowned technology theorist and researcher with your own very like storied practice. And I'm sure also like in your own work in particular, like we have to like revisit concepts, right? And sort of think about how they're applied right now in like a modern context, how they exist as metaphors and how they also exist historically. And I think that's really important when we think of glitch. Like there is glitch art, which is actively seeking different kinds of breaking software, of breaking different kinds of tools, of seeking error states. And then there is the metaphorical practice of taking that, or not the metaphorical practice, almost like the recipe of taking what that practice is and applying it in other contexts, right? And so that can be looking inside of video games of when do you accidentally like no clip out into like another space, or understanding like when you can't touch something, right? And there are really great art pieces that also can sort of show that. I'm thinking of this one project Marie Fulston worked on called The Grannies, of where a group of video games designers here in the UK found, I forget in which game, but they like fell through something in the game and found this sort of empty area, and where the film is them sort of exploring and filming inside of this game area. Is that glitch art? Like I would say it's embodying a practice of seeking error. And I think that's incredibly important. And I think that's a lot of what my practice is interested in, is when something sort of says, here's a set of rules or here's a set of operations. Even if we very much align with those operations, I want to understand like when our good intentions break inside of actually making something. And that's kind of the point of feminist data set, which is to say, like, can we ever have feminist technology? And I think the answer sometimes ends up being like dot 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 dot, like no, like no, maybe. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we don't live in an intersectional world, and we are like using tools, and we're having to use tools to support all the different kinds of software and hardware projects that we're making that are not necessarily good tools. And that's a concession. And I think it's also fine to say, like, we're aiming for something, and here are the barriers to like reaching that. And that, like, you know, in a human rights context, I would never say like intentionality, like intent over impact, because it's usually opposite. It's impact over intent. But I'd say a part of feminist data is also trying to acknowledge like the intention of trying to do this is the project, and like we should still seek that and try it out, but then also acknowledge like when something very like directly cannot be achieved, what are the real barriers that stand in our way, and being very explicit about it. And so in some cases with feminist data set, the barrier isn't just I'm using a MacBook Pro or I'm having to use AWS. That is a form of a barrier. Another barrier is how does funding work when you try to pursue different kinds of artistic AI projects that also happen to be research projects that are also not contemporary art or like commercial art. And that is like a conversation that we kind of have because it comes down to how do funders differentiate a researcher in heavy quotes from an artist, and how funders and fellowships and funding bodies define research and define art. And those are, I think, also conversations worth having that you can't not have when you talk about feminist data set, because that's kind of also a large part of the project. And so I think, like, for me, when I think of seeking glitches and errors, a lot of that is really trying to expand all of that as like, or stretch it out as much as possible, almost to like the point of breaking. But I think that's important when we're talking about different systems. And I think it's also important when we're talking about, in particular, AI. Like, for example, a project I'm working on right now here in the UK, with two collaborators, Luke Kent and Patricia Kingori, or Dr. Patricia Kingori, is we're looking at hallucinations. And one of the interests that first brought us into the project was the misuse of AI hallucinations. But the official definition of hallucinate, which is also not very accurate when you recontextualize it with the hearing voices community, is this official definition is to seem to see, hear, feel, or smell something that does not exist, usually because of a health condition or because you've taken a drug. It removes a lot of the agency from those that are experiencing that. Hallucinations are also a spectrum. Like, have you ever felt your phone vibrate, but it wasn't vibrating? That's a hallucination. And so there's this whole sort of space of how this term has been really misapplied, for example, even inside of pop culture, and then also then further misapplied inside of technology, particularly with generative AI, right? And I think like these are things that, this is where my work might get slightly more academic, but I think it's also important to sort of challenge that of how do we understand and misunderstand these systems. So I think this was like, this is the definition out of like the Cambridge Dictionary, or they made hallucinations like one of the words of the year. And this is from them, quote, when an artificial intelligence, a computer system that has some of the qualities that the human brain has, such as the ability to produce language in a way that seems human, in parentheses, when an artificial intelligence hallucinates, it produces false information. Now, I don't think that that's an accurate way to describe how AI works. And I think like there's a whole subset of discussion that needs to happen of why do we center things around human intelligence for non-human systems, even if some of the pattern matching does happen to mimic how brain neurons, make patterns or associate thoughts. That's still very different from thinking and from producing and from creating. And I think these are also things we could call glitches or errors. And we can see that, as Eryk was describing, like manifested so directly in the projects he's been mentioning. But I also think how we talk about it and how we contextualize it and how we explain it has to also be like reanalyzed through this space of how does that create the glitch or the error and this misconception. And I know this sounds like turtles kind of all the way down, but I think that it is. And this is like, these are some of the things my practice is really trying to actively grapple with, is how do you understand, document, and surface the error, and then once you've done that, what next? In some cases it might just be, here are these kind of very interesting glitches from a particular system. I don't have the capabilities to maybe produce a solution. And in other cases it might be, here is a context in which we've isolated these mistakes or misconceptions, and like here could be potential solutions, here are fixes to those glitches in a way.
I want to tie that back to an earlier thread that you introduced into the conversation, Caroline, but that we didn't necessarily kind of zoom in on, which are these issues of legibility in data and research and decolonization. And because I think it intersects very much with this conversation that's emerging here around narratives, power structures, and the kind of like vectors, not in the AI sense, but the vectors in the world through which these technologies come into being.
Totally. We might have to like riff on that a little bit, because I'm like, yes, let's talk about that. And then I'm like, okay, but in what context or like how? Because I'm like, yes, that makes sense. Actually, Bessie, I'd love to know like what comes to mind for you, like with that particular question. Like,
Well,
what
I
are
think
some?
what I'm excited to draw out from both of you, I mean, we have, half hour and change of amazing insights already. But what I think is really special about both of your practices is that you are rigorous researchers and artists whose work intersects with, broadly speaking, like for good, activist human rights policy type of work. I think when a lot of people frame their understandings of artists who are working with an activist lens or who are taking any type of political stance, it is to reflect upon, and there's nothing, I mean, that it is great and noble that artists do that. But there's another layer to it when we're dealing particularly with something like AI, which is interacting with the human population writ large every day and evolving every day. So yeah, I think that, I don't want to like tighten the question too much, because I do want it to be sort of like a popcorn style discussion, because I think there's just so much latent insight that you have to share.
Totally. I mean, I think a lot of my practice tries to also be like reflecting with, so either like reflecting with communities or like reflecting with policymakers, right, or reflecting with technologists, or reflecting with other artists. I think, I guess this is sometimes where I will also say like, and this might sound controversial, there are times where I feel like sometimes we expect like too much of art, if that makes sense, or of artists in a way that feels unfair given like the power structures that are currently in place. Meaning like sometimes in
Mm.
academic spaces what I will see is people sort of being like, artists are superheroes. And I'm like, yes, artists are superheroes. We can do really amazing things, but they're not compensated, right, at the same level of like a senior researcher or like a researcher that might receive an academic grant, for example. And I see this a lot when I see like interdisciplinary open calls, that there's usually like a very set amount for like the artist commission fee, whereas like when you go through an academic open call, the budget is quite open because it's being tailored to the research project, right? So it's not saying like, and in some cases it might be like, try to get it in under this amount, like try to structure the research under like 50K. I don't often see things where it's like, here's $3,000, do a research, right? Whereas like a lot of artist commissions will be like, here's $3,000, do an art. And we'd love to see you like do this art. And so one of the reasons I sort of, this might sound really like wishy-washy, is I think that there are times in which people expect artists to be these lone like beacons or voices or like early warning systems, if you will, to sort of try to really sort of misshape Marshall McLuhan like theory and framework, or early distant warning systems. And on one hand, like, yes, artists can be that, but I also think it puts us in a dangerous position to assume that all art is that. And I think one of the dangers is that not all artists are going to be experts in a particular subject, in the way that not all academics are particular experts in another subject, or even are that nuanced, because like we're talking about a group of people. I also think it makes it harder to then sort of allow art to sort of be like, I'm very specific in terms of how I make, because I have a policy background and I care about policy, and I would like people to care about policy more, but I also don't know if I want to live in a world where all artists are policy experts, right? Or are necessarily going through and asking the same questions I am, because then we would just be producing the same art, and that would be really boring in a way. But there are also times where I'm like kind of like begging not just artists, but like society to like have a higher level of like criticality sometimes when they're approaching a subject, versus being like, this is amazing. I'm like, yes, okay, like, but do you think that there's even like 1% of something wrong with this? Like, probably. Like, most things are that you love also have downsides to them. Like, I love cookies. There are downsides to cookies. Like, there are. We can talk about them.
Slandering cookies on this podcast.
I know. How dare I, right? But you know what I mean? Like, so we could have that kind of conversation. So I think some of it is, I don't know, I think that there is a lot of nuance that needs to be taken in terms of like approaching all of these different topics. I think it can be harder to have, for me, it's harder to have like specific conversations about sort of broader things, because in a way of which like, I want more people to be engaging with policy and be engaging with criticality. Also, on the other hand, I also don't necessarily want to say like art has to be this, right? Or like policy has to be this thing. I think it's actually enlarging the scope of both of those domains to allow for more interdisciplinary work. So instead of saying policy should have art in it, or has to have art in everything, rather, how can you enlarge the definition of what policy is to incorporate creative interventions and creative research? And with art, instead of saying, I think all art needs to be political, I think all art actually is political, because even if you're saying it's apolitical, it's actually political. But actually enlarging the scope of what art is allowed to be, and allowing for research-driven art, which might feel in some cases closer to journalism. Like, I see this a lot when, or not a lot, but I've heard people sort of contextualize, let's say, forensic architecture not as art. And I'm like, that feels like it is art, actually. But I can see from certain arguments why a curator or another artist might not see it as, in heavy quotes, art. That to me speaks to like, we need to in broaden this definition of what art is and what art is allowed to do. And I think to me that's the biggest issue, is sort of saying art can be many different things and achieve many different things. So how do we sort of widen the scope of the umbrella of what art is to allow for politically engaged art, or arte utile by Tanya Bruguera, like useful art or utilitarian art?
I think there's an element of reading the room that I would appreciate more in artists, as well as particularly around the AI space, because I occasionally get sort of thrown in with sort of very uncritical artists, and part of the response to me saying something, so part of it is my own bias, which is I came up around net art where like everything was critical. And to me, art has always been sort of a way of thinking critically about the world. And so it has always sort of like my own bubble, my own weird isolation where I'll meet somebody who is using Midjourney, using Stable Diffusion, whatever, making pictures and getting into the same shows or, you know, adjacent work being put together with my own. And I will start the conversation like, oh, like, like here's all, like, let's acknowledge all the problems. And there's a sort of a surprised look on the face of people when who either they don't know or they're surprised that I care. Right. There is, that's when this idea that like the artist is the silver bullet to solving your research problems really started to fall apart for me. And it was a little bit disheartening because I just always thought like, oh, like artists are superheroes and I want to be a superhero when I grow up. But it is a real limit, I think, of thinking about art in this very specific way. And that very sort of narrow boundary around what an artist is that is set upon by funding organizations, research organizations, universities, whatever, also I think is reflected in the artists themselves, who are oftentimes very defensive if there's a question of, well, this tool, you know, you are painting with asbestos, right? You are painting with a tool that has problems. There's kind of a defensiveness to it that I think gets in the way of a lot of the type of work and a lot of the sort of what I ultimately think is a fundamentally useful part of the craft of art making, which is that criticality, which is to think critically about the relationship to one's own set of tools. So I think that all of these problems are a bit, or these concerns are a bit interconnected. I would also never be prescriptive about what artists should do. But I do know what interests me, and I do know that when I have conversations with people who are surprised that the tool they're using is built on data sets that were taken without consent, for example, or that constantly reinforce racist stereotypes, misogynistic stereotypes, and that there are systems of power linked to those, that should not be a surprise to anyone who's using them. And it shouldn't stop you from using them, but it should inform the way that you use them. That is a long distance. I want to be clear that I flag it. It's a long distance from the question that you initially asked.
What I'm thinking about is artists, the artist's orientation or positionality in a human rights or policy context. I certainly would never advocate for the position of like artists need to save the day, because Caroline, as you pointed out, artists are often the most underpaid in the sort of in those types of frameworks where it's kind of just like, here's a set fee, it's usually nominal, and like go create a miracle for us, and also, by the way, make it beautiful and appealing and newsworthy and all that. But what I think you both do really well in across a number of different aspects of your work is you show why an artist's perspective is important in these contexts. So I just want to like kind of blow open that conversation a little bit more, and also reflect on some of the other observations you have related to other artists, but also, you know, policy, human rights, etc.
Totally. So yeah, it's just thank you so much for that, Jesse. And I think that that's also like really important context. I mean, I think one thing I really reflect on is like I was on a panel with an artist I really deeply respected. We were talking about like deep fakes and like mis and disinformation, and this artist was getting like some things wrong about deep fakes and also just some things wrong about mis and disinformation. And I was really reflecting on it, one, because they are so smart, but also two, with the recognition of like, oh, just because I've immersed myself into mis and disinformation doesn't mean that other folks will sort of go maybe like as deep in terms of doing a project. There's something that inspires them. Maybe they're responding to a current urgency. So I think like to answer your question, I think it is always contextual or nuanced in terms of how do you want to engage with an artist. And I think it is again, like sort of broadening the definition of what does it mean to do human rights work, or what does it mean to think about research. But I think it's a not even a two-way street, it's like a multiple way street. It's like walking across Times Square or something, there's many different ways to cross that street or area. Because on one hand, I've found, like, when I've worked with human rights folks, and I've run quite a few workshops with human rights organizations to be like, why art is great. They often think about it in terms of advocacy campaigns. And I'm like, oh, you don't need an artist, you need a fabricator, like you need a creative technologist. So I think there are barriers to sort of expanding these definitions. And one of them is people, I don't think, quite understand what art is unless they're making art. Meaning, like, if you're giving an artist a directive to make something, you have to be really okay with them really reinterpreting and like expanding and pulling apart and putting back together that directive in a way that if you maybe gave it to a designer, there would be a different level of interpretation. And so, like, one thing I think that is kind of important is for it, and this is harder to do, I think, in the human rights space, because when you're commissioning, let's say, research, you're often going to a researcher and being like, look, we found these issues. This is like maybe the hypothesis we're thinking about. Can you go and dive more into this and surface some more particular problems, right? And that's like I'm not gonna say it's straightforward, but it is a bit more straightforward than to sort of go to an artist and be like, here's an issue. How would you respond to this issue or topic, right? And I think some artists who, let's say, have a very deep background, like I'm thinking a lot about like Nancy Baker Cahill, for example, like, big fan of hers, as you know. If I were to commission research art about reproductive justice, like that is someone to go to, because I know that Nancy has such a deep background and interest in that, and also already understands the nuances. I think where it gets harder is like, what if I did an open call and I was like, I have a pot of money and I want something that's research driven and I want it to sort of do these different things. It might actually be really hard to sort of commission someone and kind of let them sort of go off and make the work without it being much more collaborative back and forth, right? And mimicking, let's say, a more structured research commission process that you would see on the human rights side, which for artists might feel really limiting, right? They might feel like, why are you so involved in my artistic practice? And so I think that there's different frameworks in which people make. And those frameworks can be hard to translate from like one side to the other side. And so either like there needs to be a recognition on both sides around how work happens and what work looks like. And then also I think a deeper sort of context and nuance of like, we have to allow, I think, for creative research to be more inside of policy and human rights spaces. And right now, a lot of the creative research people point to tends to be data visualization or work like forensic architecture, primarily because it's so rooted in something that is still very traditional research, like journalism, right? And so people can see how the creative process in those spaces really is beneficial to human rights. I think where it gets more complicated would be, and like, let's keep going down that maybe this example, like if I were to take some of Nancy's work and bring it to a human rights conference and try to explain how this is also research, I would have to do a lot more contextualizing. Like they could not look at the output or, like it would be hard for some of them. I think some people could see certain projects of Nancy's and be like, yes, this output makes sense. And other projects, it would have to be like, let me sort of contextualize a little bit more of the process here, right? And I think that is the most difficult thing, is having people understand those processes. Now, with that in mind, I think it also really depends on like the artist, for example. Like Nancy's a good friend, I'm not gonna speak for Nancy, but I'm sure if like Planned Parenthood approached Nancy and was like, would you be interested in doing artistic driven research on this particular subject in this region? Like Nancy would probably be very open to a back and forth. Again, I don't want to speak on behalf of my friend, but I'm assuming so, right? Or it's like if someone came to me with that sort of directive of like, yes, I'm willing to do that also because I understand why you're asking that. And I understand like why the back and forth has to happen when we're dealing with a highly charged, politicized topic that's so urgent, right? And that is so much of human rights, right? And so then what really matters is what information is being presented in the project, or like what topic is the project on, and how is that topic being engaged with in like the final output or artifact. And that actually does really deeply matter in a human rights context. So like I often make this joke, and I apologize for making it on here, but I think everyone will be receptive of it. But it's like sometimes, if you see a piece of art, let's say like a blue ceramic bowl, and someone's like, it's about white supremacy, and you're like, where is it in the, show me on the bowl, like, where is that? And that's, that's me being really facetious and probably an asshole, but I've seen that in other tech art where people will be like, it's all these topics and white supremacy. Well, like, if you're working with a human rights group that's talking about white supremacy, they would also be like, where? Like, how are you manifesting that topic? And I think that is, again, this sort of facetious example, but that I think is kind of important to talk about, is not all artwork can manifest as human rights research, and not all like human rights subjects might work well through artistic intervention. And I think it's having an understanding of how to make many different things to sort of be able to decide that. Some things might actually just manifest better as like an advocacy campaign or some kind of like digital takeover, right? That might not be art, but it's still really urgent and it's still really creative and it's still research. And I think it's expanding all of those things and allowing all those points to be legitimate in their own way is, for me, I think more what needs to happen is having the legitimacy of all those different things, and then deciding with the right group, the right artist, the right context, and the right budget, like what it is you're going to make.
Eryk, I don't know if you had any reflections on that as well.
No, I don't think I have anything to add.
All right. You both work on something called ARRG. I don't know if it's pronounced like pirate style or like exclamation style.
Yes. Yes, it is. The proper way to pronounce it is in pirate speak.
Okay, great. So you run a newly formed entity called ARRG. Could you tell me a little bit about what that is?
Yes. So ARRG is, I'm not going to do it because you already said it properly, is the Algorithmic Resistance Research Group, ARRG, and then an exclamation point to emphasize the pirate nature of it. And the Algorithmic Resistance Research Group, I think, is a way of thinking about and modeling this idea of algorithmic resistance as a concept. What are strategies that artists can show about the relationship that we have with algorithmic systems, algorithmic culture, data-driven systems, such as artificial intelligence, and to say that actually we don't have to take it passively. There's a lot of problems with the assumption that people are a passive audience to technology. I think one of the most interesting things and important things to realize is that we should not be giving away agency to the technology in the way that we build the technology, but also in the ways that we understand the response to that technology. So I think ARRG, and we will all have different answers, but for me, ARRG was a way of saying, how do we start to put some of these ways of thinking together and sort of frame them as saying there are different ways to have relationships to these technologies, and show some examples of the kind of relationships so that people can get a better sense of what it might look like to have different relationships. I think what's nice about it is that it has been able to show. So we did a collection of work, we being myself and Caroline and Stephanie Swanson, and we were at DEF CON 31, a hackers convention in the dead sweltering heat of August in Las Vegas, and we were able to show this work at a conference that was essentially information security people who were, I will say, not everyone, right? But the dominant sort of reason that people are there is to think about safety as it is defined by the AI's perspective, right? How it couldn't be hacked, how to make sure that information stored in a LLM is secure. That was sort of the position. And we were there, and I think part of our agenda, to put it in a overly harsh term, was to expand the ways that we could address the problems of AI, to show that there is a broader scope than information security concerns when we were talking about security. And so we brought projects that emphasize sort of the challenges of AI, where the data comes from, how it misrepresents and overemphasizes, how it stereotypes, how decisions make their way into these tools, and how those decisions become automated and then more and more entrenched when you build systems on top of them. We emphasized environmental concerns. We emphasized concerns about information security in the sense of what's accurate, what isn't, and just trying to blow up some of the myths of what goes on in this technology, what this technology, I think a way of reframing what the primary concerns of the technology are. So I think ARRG was oriented to challenging that, to widening the scope. And I think it's an interesting little dot to place on that conversation that you just had as well about the role of artists. And that is one of those roles, right? Is expanding the scope of the conversation in situations where they are invited. I'm a big fan of Sarah Watkins Fisher and this idea of parasitical resistance, that you are offered hospitality and an artist is in many ways trying to test the limits and the boundaries of that hospitality. But that if you are hosting that artist, maybe that's part of the benefit of having that artist in your space, is to understand the limits of your own hospitality. Now, that takes a great amount of self-awareness. And I will say the DEF CON 31 folks that we worked with, more or less were okay with us doing it. There were some frictions, but they were not, I don't want to overstate them. But that I thought was kind of a nice way of getting into this platform, that DEF CON 31, this hacker convention, is a platform, and actually kind of hacking the platform. So hacking the platform of DEF CON 31. So since then, ARRG has kind of tried to get into some other projects. We're putting a zine together, which is entirely going to be offline. We are in the process of editing that zine. And I think we all have our individual projects, and it's not always done as ARRG, but they kind of, ARRG is open to anyone who kind of wants to participate in any given project. And it's always designed to be this sort of porous, loose collective of people who are trying out this as an artistic strategy and playing with this as an artistic strategy towards some broader goal or aim.
I mean, this is also to say, too, that we are trying to also write more grants as ARRG and solidify our ARRG-ness, if you will, like the specific kind of approach we take. But I also think, too, to share like a little bit more about DEF CON. So like, I know this is recorded, but other people might not see the video. When I was making a face earlier about the mention of DEF CON in August, it's because Las Vegas is so fucking hot for people that don't have a context. And so much of that conference, I think, was all of us being like, whew, like this is a heat. But a lot of my human rights practice actually has come from the privacy and security space, which is also incorporates aspects of DEF CON. So like understanding the very necessary roles and ways to hack technology, and that's actually important because that's how you surface vulnerabilities. And you need to surface those vulnerabilities and flaws to protect people. And so hacking is so similar to glitch and like seeking the error. I would say I would not define myself as a hacker because there's very particular communities associated with that. I want to respect the folks that like do self-define as that. But I think like I'm inspired by a hacktivism ethos, and I think ARRG is as well, of seeking these errors. And I think ARRG is a great example of like why you need artists and creatives involved in research, because how artists approach looking at things and making things and innovating, particularly in a technology space, is like so necessary, particularly when we're starting to talk about, or I think not starting to talk about, but I think in the particular context of, let's say, like generative AI. And I think that that's just one example, but it's an easy one. And perhaps it's easy because we tend to do a lot of work on generative AI and about generative AI and about the errors of generative AI from more traditional social justice or bias examples of errors to very esoteric ones. But I think it really speaks to why artists are or need to be involved in that research process. And this is where I think sort of understanding then the arts as a particular very nuanced set of skills, like an intellectual set of skills, a trade set of skills, as like a research driven process, I think is where that's where it's so important. And like it, I think regardless of what medium you work in, you could be a painter, you're an expert of pigments, you're an expert of making things, of understanding how paint works, of how it interacts with all different kinds of surfaces. That is an expertise. I was trained as a photographer, understanding how light works with different kinds of cameras, of how even just light bulbs themselves will photograph differently based on the film you're shooting or the settings you have. That is an expertise. It's also understanding how film or how light literally exists inside of a negative, or how pixels understand light. Those are particular technical skills that I think, if again we sort of go back and look at, let's say, artificial intelligence, it actually gives you a lot of nuance in terms of, I think, understanding an artificial image versus, let's say, a digital image taken by a camera. That is, again, a very particular kind of skill set. And like, we can't deny that that is a skill, and we can't deny that that is an expertise. And I think these are just some examples as to like why artists need to be involved more, and not even just referenced as a class that is impacted by AI, but actually engaged with as a set of practitioners. And for me, this is probably where I think your earlier questions, Jesse, this is the context in which I'm like, okay, yes, this example, human rights, academics, policymakers, you need to be engaging with artists even beyond questions of copyright and ownership. And because of how people make, because of how artists can understand media, of how artists make with digital media, even if they're more traditional crafts folks, right? They're coming from even a crafting background. There's still a lot of actual nuance to that. Like I think about this a lot, even when I was sort of learning game design, of being really surprised to see how a physics engine worked inside of, or how physics works inside of Unity, for example, because I was trying to light certain scenes based on how I was taught to light physical spaces with lighting from my lighting class. And I was like, oh, this is so different, because I knew that if I wanted light to bounce in a certain way in a physical room and how that was going to appear on a screen, I know how to do that with an actual lighting kit, right? And this is just, so like when you understand, let's say, how a digital world works or how certain game engines work, you also understand their physics models and their physics engines, right? And that is, again, a particular kind of expertise. It also means you can understand how something is built or misused, or how to read, again, a certain kind of space. It also means you understand certain other capabilities. So if you're a craftsperson working with, let's say, wood, you have a very clear understanding of how structures function, what is a safe structure, what is possible, right, in terms of building, in a way that I, as a non-builder, architect, craftsperson, would not understand, right? So I might look at a structure and be like, yeah, that seems fine. Someone else might look at it and be like, that's impossible. Again, that is an intellectual skill and a trade skill, and both those are together. Trade skills are intellectual skills, right? And I think this is where bringing artists in beyond just sort of paying artists lip service, or beyond saying like, oh, an artist is going to get paid less, and so we have to we have to represent them and defend them. It's like, no, actually bring them into the process. Like, they might uncover things or see things totally different than you do about this technical system because of what they know about their very particular craft and how that craft actually works, and like what is possible inside of their particular craft. And AI is not hindered by those possibilities, right? Like when light exists inside of an AI generated image, it's not functioning the way that light actually functions inside of a photographic image, for example, even if I'm lighting it artificially, right? Light is manifested incredibly differently, often inside of those images, right? And I know that as someone who knows probably way too much about how light works inside of images. So I think those are some of the things that, like, ARRG, we talk about a lot, and we're trying to like document and write about more. But I think it also sort of helps embody like why ARRG exists. We're interested in playing and breaking with these systems, and also understanding that how we go about engaging with those systems is going to be different, and that differentness, like that arginess, is really needed, because we're it's coming from this very different but expertise based practice that is not necessarily understood or recognized inside of spaces of like STS, traditional like socio-technical academic studies or computer science studies, or even human rights analysis.
Yeah, I think artists can find the slack in a system, to use what Watkins Fisher sort of describes as the play in the system, right? You can find the loose threads and you could start knitting with them. You could start pulling them together. And I do think that's another way of finding a different set of insights about the limits of a system, the flaws in the system, but it also is just a fundamentally different relationship to the system, because you are not looking at what it does per se, but you're looking at how it can be steered and how you can manipulate the system in order to find new creative outcomes. And when I say as artists, I really, I think we've already done this. The nuance, we've put nuance on a bumper sticker, and we're gonna start selling them. But nuance exclamation mark,
all caps,
all caps. But I think it's hashtag not all artists, right? Like, but there is the type of art that I think I'm most interested in, the type of art that we would define as kind of critical AI art, this type of stuff, that is the position. And I think that is the strength of it, is ultimately the most critical AI artist is someone who's not using AI at all. And I can understand that position. In many ways, that is the correct position. But you lose your ability to shape and contribute to the manipulation of that system, to revealing the cracks in the logics of those systems. And by all means, step away from it, if you don't want to do it. 100%, like I said, that's correct. That is the quote unquote, the correct relationship. But I'm more interested in becoming sort of entangled with it as a way of finding what the weaknesses are, finding also when people make assumptions about what AI is or does, being able to say, I disagree with that. I see it differently, and I see it differently because I've been able to manipulate it. I've been able to get inside it a little bit closer to the belly of the thing. Again, this idea of the parasite. The parasite is inside the technological system too. And I think about that as part of what I'm doing. I don't want to, if I kill this thing, that's fine with me. But I'm also like, that's not ultimately the goal, is not to destroy a system. It's to understand what I can siphon from the system, how I can manipulate that system, and how I can find ways in that kind of shift the way the system's producing something. And that is a parasitical relationship. And I think it's important that we have a parasitical relationship to these systems, because they have a parasitical relationship to us, whether we acknowledge it or not. And so really we're just parasites on parasites at different levels of the game. So I think that's the benefit to me, and the benefit of thinking about this relationship to these technologies for me as an artist. And I think other artists might benefit from doing that. I mean that in a personal sense, not just in that they would make art that I might enjoy more, but that it might inform some of what they do, and they might not walk away doing something specifically with that. But that experience is one that changes what you make, and I think it informs what you make, and it shapes what you make, for better or for worse.
I really
And
love
just
it.
to Yeah, and just to quickly interject, I think like what Eryk is saying really obviously resonates with me, and it's also making me reflect on just maybe it's because like my practice started in photography, and so much of photography is um, drawing with light, and at times seeking the mistakes and glitch of what a camera will do, and understanding like when it does that and how to use that to your advantage. And this might just have been, because I went to photo school, like I graduated the year Instagram launched, so a very different time. But for me, I think this is like what Eryk is describing feels so much like a photographer's practice of like is understanding how does this tool you're using work, how's it a system, how can you misuse it, and when you can understand the misuse, um, in some cases, I think with like perhaps like generative AI, where it currently stands, we might end up dismantling it entirely. In a lot of cases, I think with like technology based art, of which I would actually incorporate photography in that, it's very driven by technology. A camera is a piece of technology. You end up not almost like you end up refining it, but I think you also end up making new tools that expand the field. And it expands the field in very necessary ways to like in terms of innovation. And I don't think you can decouple that. But that isn't to say all art practices are like that, but I think a lot of them are. And I think another example we could point to is music broadly and generally, right? How certain instruments are made, how instruments get adapted, how do you create augmentations of those instruments, or things you would use, let's say like different like I think like pedal mechanisms to impact the sound of what it is you're playing, of synthesizers. And I think that has to come from an expertise of understanding music and like musicality and how people perform. And like that is this interplay between the technology and the limitations, which are actually great, of what it is you're making with. The constraints inspire, I think, creativity. And then seeing what you make out of the constraints and how do you push those constraints more. And then that's where the innovation and augmentation comes from, is understanding, okay, this is what I can do with sound. What are like additions to that, right? And I don't know, I see that a lot also with like images and video as well. And I think that is again like why an artistic practice is very much needed. And I think a lot about, again, in another human rights context, when people talk about documentation of, let's say, like war crimes or atrocities, of how do you verify? Well, when you understand how images work and you understand how images are taken digitally, you can start to insert different kinds of verification into image files, right? We can trust those. You can't do that if you don't understand how images work, or you don't understand how people are documenting, or you don't understand how photojournalism works, right? And I think for me, this is a great example of where those expertise also come together in a very particular way, right? But still as an example. And I don't know, I think this is one I just wish more 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 non-creative researchers had at top of mind.
AI literacy in general, I think, is weirdly defined. Like increasingly, this idea of critical AI literacies means that like it means prompt engineering, which is I think one of the most ridiculous things to be concerned about, because it's literally a interface designed to be easy, right? So like when you start talking to universities and they're trying to pivot to this sort of idea of like how do we teach kids how to be prompt engineers, right? What you are actually asking, and I'm not dismissing that, right? But what you should be actually asking, and what many are actually asking in that question, is how do you get students to understand what they are doing when they prompt and what that prompt is, right? And so you have this sort of small ecosystem, I think, of people who are just well, what are the words that you can use to get certain results, which is a type of literacy. But I think the critical AI literacy really would rely on what is a practice that folks like ARRG have sort of accidentally invented, which is that critical relationship and feedback, understanding the feedback and understanding that sort of steering mechanism that you can have through prompts, through the technology. But then there's this other layer of literacy, which is, what is it doing? Now you've seen what it does for you individually. Now what does it do at scale? And those questions of scale are also really important, and they're really sort of a fertile place for artists to start being able to point at. And I think it's really important that as artists we do think about AI literacy as part of a byproduct of the practice, in the sense of that critical AI literacy and the sense of linking the individual things that we can do as people to the broader sort of impacts, social impacts of these things. And then also to understand that the relationship comes before we even intervene, before we even come to the prompt window. This thing has had a history of development. The data has come from somewhere. There is a lineage to all technology that we are a part of in our current moment that will continue beyond us, but we are shaping that. And I'm reminded that Sam Altman, of all people, talks about this relationship between social and technological futures, saying that, technology always advances and society always responds. And I would say that we need a Sam Altman of the social, right? Which is will be the polar opposite of a Sam Altman, is many people who have their own version of expertise and have a means of saying, let's look at the scale, let's look at the outcomes of this thing. And so I think it's really important to think about what artists can do in that context, right? As one of the sort of opposite sides. I'm very sorry that I said the Sam Altman of the social, because that is a horrible analogy. You can keep this in. I'm apologizing for it. But I hope the point is made that if we are trying to look at a social and technological sort of balancing act, what we actually are looking at is a tension. And Sam Altman is on one side of that tension. Technology companies are on one side of that tension, and they are not looking for the social side of that tension. They are not looking to give it any advantages. And so as artists, I think part of what we're doing is kind of raising that awareness, raising that critical lens, elevating that critical lens so that more people can be part of that conversation. And this is the resistance part of algorithmic resistance, right? They can shape that quote unquote techno-social future that Sam Altman apparently really wants us to fight against. So let's do Sam a favor and show him what resistance looks like, right? That's part of what I think our work should be doing. Again, hopefully people are taking my tongue in cheek squarely, but I think the point is made.
What comes to mind is like Heath Ledger's Joker. There needs to be a context. Like there's always a context, and it can sometimes be productive, not to use too sort of like capitalist utilitarian language, but like it can sometimes be productive for there to be somebody like Sam Altman for you to crystallize or clarify how you need to orient yourself. And so I totally take your meaning.
When we are talking about this sort of social and technological tension, one of the things that we often see from technology companies is this illusion, this sort of story, this myth that they've always done it responsibly and they've always gotten it right, so trust them. But if you actually look at the history of technology and the way that it has been implemented, it has been social friction that has been introduced to the introduction of those technologies that has ensured that the technology has been shaped in any ways that it has actually been ethical or responsible. It has never been the companies doing it out of their own goodwill. It has always been because they've introduced a technology that overreached. It always overreaches on the first implementations. The social response has always been mobilized and said no. And then the technology companies say, okay, okay, okay. And then they erase any evidence of any resistance, of any history of that resistance from the social spheres. The labor movement, right? Civil rights movements, the ways that these have responded to technologies of surveillance, control, manipulation, to the extent they've ever been steered in better directions, it's been because people have fought against them, have resisted them, and then that history's been erased. And so I think one of the things that we need to keep alive, and one of the things that artists can infuse into their practice as a thing to keep alive, is that flame of resistance, that spark of resistance. If it comes down to, maybe that's the point we're at, that we need sparks instead of flames. But I think artists really, that is a really important role, is to say, it is up to us, and there is a collective responsibility. And I think that artists should be thinking about that collective responsibility. Artists can be thinking about that. I don't want to say should, but many artists can be thinking about that. And I think it is a hopeful position for artists to be taking. That's what I mean by the Sam Altman of the social sphere. I mean, labor activists, union organizers, right? Like civil rights people, the anti-Sam Altmans.
Well, I reference this book with a grain of salt. Everybody, read it for yourselves. But I'm thinking about what's outlined in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, how, like, as you said, the suffragette movement, the civil rights movement, all of these have been retroactively mythologized as peaceful. And that has been weaponized against protest across Western democracies as the only right way of organizing. And I don't know what, to carry your term, I don't know what successful algorithmic resistance looks like yet, because we don't have very many models of it. So that's why I'm excited about this endeavor y'all have undertaken, is because I think it starts to reveal what these forms of algorithmic resistance might be. And obviously there's that example you had on the website of like, with an Alexa, and that's like a funny, playful example, which I please share what that example is. But then it also, from within the playfulness, opens up to like, what are those real forms of algorithmic resistance and resistance to, algocracy and algorithmic regimes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that piece in particular is as you correctly identified it as silly, but it is simply this observation that if you ask Alexa to play Billy Joel's Downeaster Alexa, it plays that song up until the point that Billy Joel says the Downeaster Alexa, at which point Alexa pauses and asks what you want. And I've seen some other songs and things play with this. Bitnik has a piece that's a nice exploration of this. So what are we? Let's take that joke and ruin it by taking it apart, right? What are we actually doing? Well, we're looking at what is the input to that system, right? Which is just this word, Alexa. And we're distancing ourselves from the way that input is supposed to be used, right? It is supposed to be used to harness, to beckon the technology and introduce our voices into an algorithmic system in order to order some food or get directions or the weather to benefit Amazon. That is what that gesture, Alexa, speaking to the Alexa, does, right? That is the purpose of that gesture. So now let's take it. It's a gesture. We can identify that as a kind of movement or like a choreography. How do we then restructure that and recontextualize that to create a different kind of outcome from the system? So yeah, that joke isn't funny anymore because I've just explained it. But in that joke is like, what makes that joke funny, if you even think it's funny? What makes that joke funny is that tension of what Alexa is supposed to be doing and what we can actually make it do, which reveals the sort of behind the surface structure of how that entire system has been wound up. And it unspools that thread and it pulls at that thread. That's why I chose that particular performance piece as the example, is because I do think it shows the different ways that we can engage with these systems and get into them and manipulate them. And you can use that for harm, right? The sort of the idea of, The very unfunny example of the Taylor Swift's pornography deepfake is actually a very similar impulse, right? But I do think that if we can reveal those things, it's not about necessarily using them for good or evil. It is about showing that they are possible and that there is a story beyond the one that the interfaces tell us about our relationship with the tool we are trying to use. And that, I think, is important. And I would never, condone this sort of abuse of that. But that's actually why we do it, is so that we can sort of flag these things and say we can have this relationship, but we can use them to benefit each other, which is not necessarily benefiting the technology companies, right? But we can reveal those things in order to build up a kind of immunity, to use this language of parasites, that helps us see them, helps us understand the ways that we are being manipulated, and helps us understand the ways we can cultivate a vocabulary of resistance, the way we can cultivate models of resistance, borrowing that idea of the model from AI very deliberately. But it's a social model, it's a individual model and it is a collective model, right? It's all intertwined, of saying, actually, this thing doesn't know anything and I can do what I want with it, is a good point for thinking about what do we want it to be doing, and potentially challenging the things that we don't want it to be doing.
Yeah, and I'd also say, though, like, taking that theory, because I know Eryk is talking about some of his own particular work, but I think, like, that can be applied to all AI systems, and it should be, and I think it's very necessary. And I also think, particularly when we look at generative AI, what I find really exciting about the projects Eryk does, the projects that Steph does, some of the projects I do, is that I think it's also kind of positing, like, do we even want this system? Like, is this the right system? Like, earlier on, Eryk was talking about prompt engineering. I have a lot of big feelings about writing prompts, as Eryk knows, and I like. I'm not going to get into them here because we'd be here for like another hour. But I think that there is something to also sort of be said about even just the way that these tools are designed and interfaced, and how much they don't serve artistic practices, that they're almost like sledgehammers in which we need scalpels. And I think a lot of the work that I find really interesting that Eryk does, that Steph does, that I do, is also kind of like I'm interested in trying to document the labor of how much workaround we do to get interesting things, right? And that it's not just like that there's so many things that you also can do with certain AI systems, or we could be doing and we should be doing in terms of probing them, of like, imagine a system that would let you probe and look at and change the latent space of a model as you're creating, right? Or if you just sort of applied certain interfaces from Adobe to aspects of generative AI and bringing in your own work, how much that would change or expand the ability of creativity. And I'm describing a project that, like, luckily I get to work on in the future with through UK funding, called Braid, because that is like the focus of the project, is what kinds of augmentations do artists need with AI tools that actually help embody a creative practice that could help, one that would support working artists and that are also compliant with law and policy. But I think that that's actually incredibly worthwhile to think about. And I think, in terms of like, that might seem like a small thing, like what are the interfaces? But I think that that comes back to, how does this tool work and who designed it and for what purpose, and who do these tools serve? There's this great quote from this report that I want to say the Oxford Internet Institute put out, where they're quoting Luba Elliott, this amazing curator here in the UK on AI. And Luba was sort of describing, and I'm going to butcher this quote, of how a lot of artistic AI tools are made by developers who do not have, let's say, artistic practices. And they're either made with the assumption of what art creation looks like, or they're kind of made reflected on their own practice, but they do not have, let's say, general artistic practices. I think this sort of speaks to kind of some of the issues that we will sort of brush up against in terms of like why it's so important to probe and engage with these systems, is also just like we have to probe at them, we have to hack them, we have to sort of remake them and break them, because they also weren't designed for us as artists to use in a way that works for how we work. And I think that that's I think it's incredibly clear, but I always get excited when more artwork is sort of engaging with that or showing that even inadvertently. Like Eryk, I don't know if your artwork, I don't know if you would describe your artwork as doing that, but for me, I could obviously very easily take your artwork and describe it in an essay of effectively doing that, even if that's not the point of some of the pieces. But I think it does speak to that of like there is a hacking and like an exploiting of the system that is necessary, and also this is representative of like the amount of work or labor Eryk has to do to also negotiate these systems as a creative.
Yeah, I think there are real constraints on what you can make with these tools if you're pushing back against the logic of the tools that's implicit to begin with. Christian Paul recently said that the current generative AI tools are claimed to be in a lineage of photography, but are actually in fact not, because the previous sort of AI as a art form has its own lineage, right? You could go back to Harold Cohen, you could go and you could look at machine learning work, you could look at Anna Ridler's work with GANs, right? Now, there is a photographic reference point there, but it is also about the logics of data sets, it is also about the logics of computation. When you look at an AI-generated image from a diffusion model, what you are getting is actually erasing much of that. Much of that is blocked off to you. You're not actually... Most of the work that's being made is about making an image, as if diffusion came from this lineage of photography. And so I think that assumption that what artists want are tools to make more photographs or things that look like paintings is a very limited view of what art is. And it kind of refuses to engage with artistic practice as a process and as a series of gestures that are chosen, right? My relationship to a tool like Midjourney is a series of gestures that I have chosen. I have chosen to engage with the prompt. I've chosen to engage that prompt in a specific way that you could almost call a performance, because I'm performing the role of a really bad user who doesn't understand like why I can't get this thing, but by God, I really want this image that I think the AI just cannot create. And so I'm engaging with it in that way, and it is almost a performance. It is a kind of series of gestures that I am engaging with in order to get around the constraints that say you want a beautiful photo of a cool car on a beach, and I don't want that. I don't want any beautiful photographs. I don't want anything that looks like a painting. I want something like really broken and weird.
Yeah.
So how do I get into these systems? For me personally, the minute they give me that, I'm done. I'm going to have to retire, because my entire practice is about finding the constraints and limits and borders and trying to push against them. So if they're just sort of if we ever get AGI, which I do not think we ever will, but that's it, I'm done. Like I can't push against it. It'll arrest me.
I'm just imagining like Midjourney being like, Eryk wants Corvettes. Eryk wants
hey,
tiny.
I swear to God,
Corvette.
Midjourney, I was asking it for an image of noise, which is at the core of my practice, right? And every once in a while with a new model, I ask it, do this again, because the noise changes every time I get a different model. It gave me R2-D2. It gave me a pink R2-D2, like absolutely pristine pink R2-D2. And I was like, why, Midjourney? and we're giving it too much credit. Let's just flag that Midjourney doesn't know,
right?
And I didn't ask it, but it is just funny the types of things you get, because it doesn't care about you. Right. Like it cannot care about you. It cannot care about the individual user. It is not learning from feedback from me.
Yeah.
Right. Even that is a myth. It is simply giving me a response to a set of words that it is linking to through clip that are linked to parts of the latent space, and then it's putting those things together in the way that it can find them in these loose constellations of pixels that it starts with, and then it removes that noise and gives you the image. And in this case, it was R2D2 because we could take that in many directions.
Who knows?
But yeah, it doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what it is designed to do. And I want to make it do what I want it to do. As an artist, I want to explore the creative terrain. And part of that is the gesture of circumnavigating what it thinks I want and what it is designed to give me.
Caroline,
I still find it funny. Maybe R2D2.
R2D2. And I'm born on May 4th, and so I actually really dislike this May the 4th be with you thing that I get all the time, so I'm particularly resentful.
But I mean, I think that just speaks to like the limitations of these tools, and like, I don't know, I still think, very explicitly, for example, Eryk, like the gestures you seek in these systems would still exist, maybe more so, with these systems redesigned, because there would be more and more ways to gesture. And I think this is like one of the larger issues also that I also think ARRG butts up against at times is the perception society has of how these tools work.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think everyone who is critical, has a criticality involving AI, also butts up against this, obviously, like society's misunderstandings of it. But I think in particular with generative AI, I don't want to over pathologize people who are big fans of it, because I think people are having personal experiences with it in a way of like, it's extending my creativity. I can do things I could, quote unquote, never do before. Could do it before. It just isn't like maybe the fidelity you wanted because you haven't practiced, or like if someone's like, I can now be a photographer, I'm like, you always could have been a photographer with these.
Just to flag too that like that is an assumption by people who make work, that the goal of making work is not the work, but the results of the work.
Right. Totally.
And so people who say I could never make a beautiful drawing have this idea of what a beautiful drawing is,
right,
which is framed around this perception of what I think is really tied to value.
I would agree.
Right, which says that if you are left-handed and drawing with your right hand, the result that you've made is inherently going to be bad because it doesn't look like Garfield. Right? But actually, the drawing that you make with your left hand of Garfield is going to be way more interesting to me. I mean, let's not overstate how interested I'd be in that, but it would be way more interesting than like a actual really good drawing of Garfield that someone did.
I think they're also highlighting what I feel like we learn in art school, which is that you learn you learn some of the fundamentals of art, and then you also learn that your interpretation of those fundamentals, like your interpretation of an event, your interpretation of a space, is actually like what is an artistic piece. It's also an artistic voice, and you learn with your tools how to hone and develop that. So like one of the things too, like I think a lot about is like sounds like to say I'm not a great dancer. I actually am probably a great dancer because I'm dancing a way that I dance. Mm-hmm. But like one of my favorite dancers is Alice Shepard, who is in a wheelchair. And she's one of the like greatest dancers in my mind, right? And so, for me to then sort of say like, oh, I'm not good at X, it's like, well, no, actually, like I could invest in time, and I could also figure out or develop a practice that works with what I can do, which is literally how I approached photography. It was like looking at what can I do, what am I interested in, what is my vision, and how do I enact that with what I have available to me. That's like the constraints this is where like constraints are innovation, right? And this is, I think, this artistic practice, and I think this is where, people who find aspects of generative AI really, like freeing, I think they're really tied up in this very specific idea of like what art is. And that to me is so sad, because art is so many things. And, you can take a photograph of a red balloon with your phone. It might not be the way you imagined it, but that for me was one of the most core parts of being a photographer, was understanding that like, I can't do everything I'm imagining. So what can I do? And how do I try to enact that vision the best way that I can? And that is what became this, I won't say the magical transformation of art, but that is the artistic practice. That is where like the goodness, if you will, like the meatiness of art comes from, is understanding the translation of the idea from your head to actuality.
And can I just say that the limits of your talent
Yeah.
are actually part of the signature that you make on the work that you are making.
Right. Limits and heavy quotes.
Heavy quotes, right. Yeah. But this idea that there are limits, quote unquote limits to what I can make as a person who draws with a pen.
Right.
Right. And that now I don't have those limits implies that you thought you were limited by a set of skills that you did not have. But in fact, so much great work is made by people who are operating within these quote-unquote limits. Think about the music made by people who did not know how to play guitar, and maybe it wasn't everyone's bag, but they picked up a guitar and they said, what can I do with this thing, right? Can I bang on this thing and figure out how to get good tones out of it, right? Think about people who had these very boring drum machines that had these limits to them, and just like they knew how to fuse some stuff together, and then they created like punk, right? Like this. There's ways of even the synthesizer itself, right? There's these boxes that make noises, and you turn the knobs. You don't have to play the synthesizer, right? This keyboard. There's all these different ways of having a relationship to outputs and steering outputs that are not defining a limit on you as an artist, but are part of the actual tools in your skill set that you can deploy strategically. And so you can have that relationship with generative AI. And I do think, like, I am a case study in that. That is my relationship with generative AI. So I don't want to take that away from people either. But what I am frustrated by is when they say, well, why is it that I can generate these things that look beautiful and I can't, like, no one's buying them and I'm not getting gallery shows when the thing I'm making looks every bit as good as, like, you know, this famous photographer? Well, the reason is because now everyone can do that. And so there is no quote unquote value. And you are looking at the art world as a system that is centered on value. And I have never been an artist who's been interested in the quote unquote value of my work. I've never made products to sell. And I don't know that that's great. It's probably this is my own limit. But there are the ways of thinking about creativity beyond the art world itself. And I think that we've restructured this to say beautiful images are what the art world values. And therefore, if I can make beautiful images, I'm part of the art world. And therefore, I am an artist. You can have that logic if you want it. But I think it's more interesting and more personally fulfilling to say that actually I want to discover something new. I want to discover and make something that doesn't follow that trajectory. And I think we are robbing people of that option when we tell them, this is how you can be creative. Type some words in, take what you get, and see if you could sell an NFT. But this is a long distance away from the political and power conversations too.
I actually would say that it's not, because it sort of like packages, for the sake of this conversation, of course, there's like, I'm probably 10 hours more on each individual sort of beat we've gone through. But like when you're talking about these questions of value, it really invokes this idea that like, if we had a different socioeconomic context, our relationship to creativity would be different. And it might be more freely like what you're describing. It might be more freely, lean into what makes you distinct. What is your signature that comes as some mess of your innate abilities or lack of abilities, the materials you're using, all those things. And there's a magic in that. And in just continuing to progress that, even if there is no market value for it. But because, Eryk, as you're saying, because we've pegged aesthetic beauty to a market context, now that's created a set of assumptions among, let's say, the general public or aspiring artists that maybe is leading them down a path, you know, full of pain and heartache in that process of learning. And so anyway, I do actually think these are very related conversations, even though on their face they don't maybe seem like they are.
It does reflect a kind of algorithmic logic of efficiency, economic value as the priority, and taking away process, right? Algorithms are designed to strip the process away because that is what makes a process efficient, reducing process. And when you minimize process, you're also minimizing the, I don't know, it's sort of, I used to use this example back in 2016 of Google Maps. Will tell you the quickest way to get to a place, but it won't tell you the nicest walk. Still doesn't, right? Won't tell you what is the most serendipitous walk, right? Or what ways you might maximize the pleasure of your stroll. It tells you how to get there the fastest. And that is a logic of algorithms that has replaced bookstores with algorithmic recommendations. You're no longer flipping through books and finding things on accident. You are being suggested things based on previous patterns. All of this is enforcing a kind of reversion to the mean, which somebody yelled at me on Twitter because I didn't use that right, but I think I did. But the central tendency of our past behavior becomes sort of a sustainable goal, where the goal is sustaining it, not breaking away from it, not sort of, right? And so we've talked about this sort of the flattening of culture, the Apple ad. We don't have to get into that Apple ad. But this flattening of culture to algorithmic prediction is also very much tied to this removal of process and discovery and self-reflection that comes through putting time into finding stuff and putting time into making stuff and taking the long way to the ice cream shop.
I think it also like cuts down on like our self evolution. Like I think about this funny anecdote I often share where like I ruined my Discover Weekly for like many years because I went through a breakup in like 2015, spent a month listening to Mumford and Sons, and I like fucked up my Discover Weekly. And I like share that as a funny anecdote because it's Mumford and Sons. And I then tried to course correct by listening to Electro Clash, and I just ended up with those as the only two things suggested. There was like no way to cleanse or to be like, I was going through a breakup. And I think it took years of me to like retrain Spotify. And part of the frustration I also had with Spotify was like, I feel like imagine like a really small, like 6x8 glass room, like in front of one of the largest libraries. And in the glass room, I'm only given like 20 things. But I know there's all these other things in the library and I can't get to it because I can't just like go. I can't just like go in there and like look through all these different lists.
Yeah.
It's hard to like search for stuff. You don't know how things are categorized. And it made me really reflect on how like I would purchase music online and physically in stores by looking at different genres, of seeing a list of what was available, of being able to listen to clips. Like I could find so much more than I could. And so this is sort of, Eryk, what you're describing is making me reflect on just like we're being sort of sold and given and packaged these things based on like algorithmic snapshots of ourselves. And they're also at times frozen in time. And there's no way to kind of evolve because it's like, oh, this is who you are. Well, no, that's who I was. Mm-hmm. But who am I now and who am I going to be? And how can I actually engage with this information as like, as an archive, as a database? Is not actually how we're like given information at all. Right. And there's almost no way to kind of break through that. And that, it becomes really frustrating, I guess, for like lack of a better phrase. Like you feel locked and stagnant in a way that doesn't have to be.
It's a perpetual high school reunion.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Every time it's just everybody from high school who can't believe that you would have ever started hiking is now in front of you forever. And that's essentially what algorithmic systems are. But in fact, you do enjoy hiking. And nothing you do will convince them.
Yeah.
Well, and I do want to surface, of course, that this is a logic predominantly of late capitalism, or as Yanis Varoufakis calls it, techno-feudalism. Algorithms and algorithmic relationships to yourself, to others, etc., could be full of serendipity and wonder. Eryk, as you're describing with Google Maps, or Caroline, thinking of your Discover Weekly example, if you had been able to go in and fine tune Discover Weekly to what your aspirational music listening moods would be, like those would be, again, all caveats about the type of language I'm using, sort of value added. And so I think it's the fact that we live in a context where those things are so thoroughly economized and designed to mine us for value at the same time. And so again, kind of wrapping this back to the human rights and policy work, I think that's where starting to think about regulatory paradigms to rein in the overreach of industry becomes really critical, because I, hold out a certain, kernel of optimism that a lot of the kind of breathless hype that people bring to the generative AI conversation, that there is something there, but it requires us to be participating in a system that is, pro-social and liberatory and not exclusively designed around generating economic value.
I agree.
Yeah. I didn't know if that would prompt anything. We have been, I'm mindful of time. You've been very, very generous to share so much of your time and insights. I have 3 recurring questions that I like to do with guests. So I'm going to kick off the lightning round recurring questions moment. And so the first of those questions is, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to? Caroline, maybe I'll throw it to you first.
I guess one thing I wish people paid, again, more attention to is from like the both sides of the world that I'm in. I do wish human rights, like, and academic researchers, like, went and searched for critical artists and like read their works and engaged with them. And then conversely, I really wish that artists who like seem to want to have a critical practice would like go and search more for like how human rights organizations are talking about technology and like the research they're doing, because I think it would foster so much and like bolster so much more knowledge exchange, and I think improve both of these, like if they're either ends of a spectrum, like just sort of improve the work that they're doing overall.
Amazing. Eryk?
I put nuance on a bumper sticker earlier with an exclamation point in all caps. I'm picturing it in black text on a yellow background. But I think that's what I wish we had more of. I don't know if it's that people pay more attention to it, but I think it's just such a weird time that we are living in such a increasingly complex. We are living surrounded by increasingly complex systems that are exponentially growing, not exponentially, but they are increasingly growing out of our control. And the response to that, it's natural and it's understandable to say, I want to say yes or no. I want to say good or bad. Whereas what you are then doing is essentially saying, I can't or won't look at all of the pieces of the system. Saying system bad is fine. The system is bad. Totally get that. But then to say there's no way of participating in it, there's no way of engaging with it, there's no way, that does not let you off the hook for curiosity and engagement about it. And I'm speaking from my own position as sort of like a white guy working in tech, right? Good or bad doesn't get me anything. Curiosity gets me somewhere. Nuance gets me somewhere. Nuance gets me starting to think about things. And thinking about things is something I think we should not be shying away from. And I flagged the very specific context, but that is where I think I wish more people would be paying attention to their own shutting down, their own response to this complexity. How are you responding to that complexity? Are you getting overwhelmed and saying no? Or are you getting curious and engaged with the pieces of it that are accessible to you? And if you're in a position where you can engage with those pieces with thoughtfulness, with sort of curiosity, I think we have a need to do that.
Amazing. I'll buy that nuance bumper sticker.
I'm not even kidding. I'm gonna make it.
Perfect. Eryk, I'll start with you on this one. What is one resource you use or recommend for making better sense of reality?
So reality is a weird one. Making better sense of reality, I don't know. But I think a tool for understanding how we're defining reality and how reality is shaping us. I get in trouble. Somebody was like, why do you use this word? And I just want to say, let's bring back cybernetics. This is my pitch. Sold you a bumper sticker. Now I'll sell you a T-shirt. Let's bring back cybernetics. Cybernetics, highly maligned, led to a lot of problems. But the problems of cybernetics, I will argue, has always been its severing. That it was dismissed as wooey and not serious in the late 60s, early 70s. And if you look at the reasons it was dismissed as wooey and unserious, part of it is because it gave a damn about the social context of technology. And that was not hard enough for the engineering mindset of the time. But cybernetics has always been saying we are within systems, our view of the system changes our relationship to that system, and our relationship to the system changes the system itself. And that is applied to a social context, what I see as the missing piece in engineering. Not that it should have been dismissed and not that it contributed to the problems, but the absence of engaging with that piece of cybernetics contributed to the problems. So the resource I recommend is let's bring back a rethought cybernetics and let's start applying some of the logics that it actually thought about and the ways that it engaged with that, thinking about the relationship between the social and the technological spheres.
Amazing. Just for folks who maybe don't know what cybernetics is, could you give a one-liner?
A one-liner?
Or a two-liner, I don't know.
Okay. Cybernetics is the study of the relationships that exist between points in a system.
Beautiful. Nailed it in a quick
Thanks.
sentence.
That's on the back of the T-shirt.
Yeah. All right, Caroline, over to you.
I mean, I guess I feel really lucky to be surrounded by a lot of really smart people. So like recently with this project on hallucinations, working with Patricia and Luke has been really helpful in terms of sense making, because a lot of that project is asking what is reality and who gets to decide what is reality. So in a very practical, very straightforward and short sense, like that project and like that mode of inquiry and engaging with, Dr. Patricia Kangori and Luke Kemp has been really amazing. I would say for me, just having like a wide variety of resources has always been helpful, or like resources in terms of news has always been really helpful in terms of sense making. So being able to follow and engage with, and I feel very lucky that some of these organizations are collaborators, like Amnesty International, Access Now, Plan C Pills, the Digital Defense Fund, like being able to sort of be kept up to date in terms of what's happening has been so influential to me. And also it being across a wide variety of community organizations and human rights focused NGOs. So I would say for folks out there, if you're feeling unmoored, it's always worth like slightly expanding maybe where it is you're reading or looking at things. And something that is just like, if you're like, I just need a resource, I would say very basically like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are great. And they have social media accounts, same with the ACLU, and they post on a variety of subjects. So if you're feeling like you don't know what's going on across a region or a subject, those organizations have like very specific kinds of content that are just helpful, I think, in terms of giving you a snapshot of what's going on in the world.
Amazing. And finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted? Caroline, we'll start with you.
I will definitely say, because I think about this a lot and it's related to the Hallucinations Project, when I started to learn actually what hallucinations were and expanding, well, and also just that like even the term hallucinations for a lot of folks who experience them is like not a term that they like. But when I learned that this phenomenon of like feeling your phone vibrate when it's not vibrating, or thinking your name's been called and it's not been called, is on the spectrum of hallucinations, to me was so mind expanding, and also helped really, like I am neuroatypical. I have ADHD, and I've had to like really rework a lot of the ways that I work and sort of create structures, and I have to often like explain or manage up in certain cases in different work environments to help contextualize like how to best work with me. And so, living during a time in which we have, there's a lot more acceptance of being neuroatypical and being neurodivergent has been really great. And sort of seeing a lot of the work, let's say, that's been done in other contexts and other places, especially around like the destigmatizing of autism, has also been beneficial to me as someone with ADHD, even though I'm not autistic, because it's opened up a conversation of normalizing how to talk about and normalizing the acceptance of this is how I work and this is how like what I need for my brain to function well. And so then learning that hallucinations and those that have them, that they've been it's been so wrongfully portrayed inside of pop culture and inside of society, and then also being then again wrongfully described via the misuse of AI hallucinations, to learn that it's actually quite a spectrum, and that's something that so many people experience. Like we all in this chat have experienced a form of hallucination that is not drug induced. It is via just like our brain thinking something has occurred and it hasn't occurred. Was incredibly eye-opening, and then also shocking that, oh, why haven't we started as a society to normalize and destigmatize and actually try to understand the spectrum of this phenomenon. So for me, that has been something that has been really really changing, like life changing recently to think about.
Eryk, over to you.
Well, so this is not bragging.
Great start.
But so I don't think this is cool anymore. But I was a teenage graffiti artist, and I remember the first time that some friends introduced me to this world. There was just putting up tags on a building, and it was really, still to this day, like very eye-opening the way that it operated, because I had never seen someone just flagrantly violate the law before, visibly just marking a building with a tag, but also that what they were doing was on a busy street surrounded by people. And it was me and a couple of friends, and there was just one friend, and we were teenagers. Again, I reiterate, this is not something that I would be doing anymore. Was writing it, and the other person was pointing at them and saying, "Nothing is happening. Nothing is happening there. Don't worry about it. Nothing is happening." And absolutely nobody on the street was interested at all. They just sort of like were like, "I'm not going to see this because this whatever is happening here." It wasn't that they believed that nothing was happening. It was that the two sort of things created so much cognitive dissonance that just saying, "I don't care about what's happening," or like, "I'm going to block this out and just go about my day," was the sort of default response. And I don't know what I learned from that, but something about my understanding of reality changed that day. Something about the way that we make sense of cognitive dissonance and tension kind of changed for me that day. And so that's what came to mind when you asked the question, which was a strange memory to go back to, but that's where I went.
Oh, I love it. And I love the little Easter egg from your past. This has been such a rich conversation, and hopefully a very, very tiny invitation to both of your massive practices. Where can people find you, and are there any projects you want to kind of call out that are forthcoming?
I'm at cyberneticforests.com. I write a semi-weekly newsletter there. And with Caroline and some other folks from ARRG, we're putting a zine together called Models for Making Distance, which is being put together from a bunch of different contributions and contributors who were from an open call. So we're going through that now, and I think it's pretty exciting to see how people have made sense of that prompt and respond to that prompt. So you can keep a lookout for that if you're interested in ARRG.
And you can find me at Caroline Sinders on pretty much everything. or follow my human rights lab, Convocation Research and Design. We are cord_lab on most places. In terms of what I have coming out, I will have a lot of stuff coming out probably in the fall. That's when I'll be like kicking off a lot of projects. And we'll have like new projects sort of coming into fruition then. We're working on the zine over here at ARRG, so keep your eyes peeled for that.
All right. Well, I certainly am. Thank you both so much for being on Urgent Futures.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.